Hi, my name is Clara Raab. I am a senior at Pacific University. I am a general music major. However, I will be moving into the medical field as an audiologist. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's an ear doctor. My capstone project is Neuroplasticity in Music, What Stays and What Goes. My capstone advisor was Dr. BP. He has let me have free reign over this unorthodox project, and I'm forever grateful for that. Since I will be going into audiology, I really wanted to center my capstone around the neurological aspects of how the brain interprets music. So today we'll be talking a little through my project outline, the questions I developed, anatomy of the brain in order to lay out a foundation, neuroplasticity, differences in brain structures between musicians and non-musicians, neuroimaging and neurophysiological studies, music and psychology, language, memory, music therapy and teaching, and then we'll conclude. After much thought, I believe that a literature review was the most suitable style for my capstone because I wanted to go more into research than anything else. I wanted to do like a broad expanse on how music does affect our daily lives and how we interpret it. So that's what I wanted to do. These are just a few of the things I focused on while I was researching. These were the two main questions that I wanted to research further into after brushing over these topics in my other communications and science disorders related courses. So the first question is, which sections of the brain are affected by music and what are their functions? And the second question is, how can this lead to different developmental processes between musicians and non-musicians? So in order for us to have a foundation of the rest of the presentation, I want to identify the lobes and their main functions. So here in blue, we have the frontal lobe, which is where your motor and emotional cortexes lie. It's just think of it as where your personality stems from. In yellow, we have the parietal lobe, which is your sensory awareness. In red, we have the occipital lobe, which is your visual cortex. In green, we have the temporal lobe, which is the star of the show today. It's where your sound is processed and memory coded. At the bottom, we have the cerebellum, which is where movement is coordinated. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have the hippocampus, which is part of the limbic lobe, and that is where a lot of memory is stored. And then at the bottom here, we have a frontal view of the brain, which is, I just wanted to highlight the gyri on the left and right hand sides of the brain. And this is like the major cortex, like right here is the auditory cortex. Sound waves travel through the ear until it hits the tympanic membrane, or your eardrum. The vibrations from the sound waves hitting the tympanic membrane cause small bones, or ossicles, in your ear to move and set off the liquid in your inner ear, in the cochlea, where thousands of nerve endings are located, and translate that movement into electrical impulses that travel along the cranial nerve, the auditory nerve, also known as cranial nerve 8, up through the brainstem and into the auditory cortex. After they reach the auditory cortex, where the sounds are processed, they move into different parts of the brain to be interpreted in order for you to respond. These impulses will move into the parietal lobe or the limbic lobe, frontal lobe, and these are all for different reasons. So here's a quick clip to show you a broad explanation of how sound is processed in the brain. So first we have sound entering the auditory nerve, going through the auditory pathway into the auditory cortex, and then all these different all these different responses all correlate to create your own response to the sound. This is the cortical homunculus. I have had to look at this lovely image for two of my CSD related courses. It is a neurological map of different parts of the brain and their corresponding motor sensors / sensory centers. So like woodwinds and brass instrumentalists will deal with a lot of this, and their hands. Strings will mainly deal with their hands. It's it's interesting. So now I can apply all this to music. So instrumentalists tend to use their fingers, and vocalists tend to engage their thoracic, like their thyroid area, because that's where the vocal cords are located. Just a totally different project. um, but this is all within the premotor cortex and related areas located in the frontal lobe, and the cerebellum is there for coordination. You'll be using the auditory cortex a lot in your temporal lobe. You'll be using the parietal lobe for like senses, like when you're feeling the instrument or whatnot. And then you'll also use your occipital lobe, the visual, because you have to read the music, right? So it's really interesting for sight reading. It's the amalgamation of all these different lobes working together. So you sight read, you're using your visual lobe, you're working your fingers to follow along, and then you'll be having simultaneous auditory feedback. It's insane. So now we'll be talking about neuroplasticity, which is the brain's way of organizing and adapting to its surroundings. This concept is how we can calibrate whether or not music has an actual physiological effect on the brain's morphology. So neuroplasticity affects all ages. When you're younger, you don't have as many white matter connectivity, like you don't have a lot of habits, so nothing is kind of a blank slate. When you're older, it's a lot harder to recreate things, but it is proven that neuroplasticity affects all ages. So we want to see like more gray matter density than white matter, because gray matter is composed of neuron cell bodies and glial cells, so a lot of information is stored in gray matter, while white matter is the connection between the gray matter. So we want to see more density in gray matter because it can fluctuate through life. So building up your gray matter earlier is vital in maintaining a healthy brain later in life. So with more gray matter, there's more white matter. And so white matter is composed of nerve fibers that transmit information to different parts of the brain. And myelin encases these nerve fibers. So more myelin means faster transmission. You're just continuously making it faster and faster. And to the right, you can see like the myelin sheaths. So with more myelin, you just have faster highways. In order to build up myelin, you have to continuously repeat a task or activity over and over again. So deliberate practice is defined as a well-defined task at an appropriate level of difficulty, accompanied by formative feedback, and also accompanied by opportunities to apply corrections and complete repetitions. So think muscle memory. Perfect practice equals perfect performance. And if you create a habit that is incorrect or leads to pain later, you have to first break that neural pathway before you can create a new one with a new habit. So old habits die hard, truly. It's also important to note that highly trained musicians have different myelin structures in this brain compared to non-musicians, indicating the strengthening of differing synapses between the two groups. So the measure of ERPs are how scientists have determined whether or not neuroplasticity actually occurs. This is just one study. So ERP, or an event-related potential, is the measured brain response that is the direct result of a specific sensory, cognitive, or motor event. So in Mia Seppänen's and her colleagues' 2012 study, they've determined that auditory ERP components such as P1, N1, and P2 are ideal for studying rapid plasticity because although they occur automatically after the presentation of any sound, these components are also sensitive to training and various top-down effects, such as active attention and reinforcement. So they concluded that there might be an indication of higher neuroplasticity in musicians compared to non-musicians, since musicians had enhanced rapid plasticity for N1 and P2, but there's not conclusive evidence on whether or not this is significant due to the lack of P1 activation. So what they're saying is, out of the three, only 2 were activated. But that last 3 would have like ensured that neuroplasticity occurs. But there is still a lot of strong evidence indicating that myelination is definitely occurring more significantly in musicians than non-musicians. So now we'll be digging deeper into the differences in brain structure between musicians and non-musicians. So in most of the articles I was reading, all of the ones who performed clinical trials in neuroimaging all had results that the cerebellum, hand area in the motor cortex, anterior corpus callosum, primary motor cortex, and other related areas were all enlarged in musicians compared to non-musicians. It's important to note that in Schlag's 2015 study, he's noted that in keyboard players, the omega sign of the precentral gyrus, which is associated with hand and finger movement representation, was found more prominent on the left hemisphere and more prominent on the right hemisphere for string players, so keyboard and string. So it's interesting to note that the right hemisphere is connected to the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere is connected to the right side of the body. So for string players who play with their left hand for the fingering part, their right hemisphere is definitely going to be more increased compared to like their bow, which doesn't have a lot of finger dexterity. But for keyboard players, since their more melody is in the left hand, or the right hand, so their left hemisphere is more enlarged, which is very important to note that different instruments require different like adaptations. So, and there was an increase in gray matter in most of the lobes that we talked about earlier. It's also important to note that arcuate fasciculus is, or AF, is a specific white matter tract that has been seen to be differentiated between instrumentalists, vocalists, and non-musicians, according to Schlag and Altenmuller. Not only was it different between the different types of groups, but it was also increased in those who had more experience and practiced more. So I just wanted to read a couple of the quotes and expand a little bit. So cross-sectional studies have shown that musically trained children are better than musically untrained children on a range of auditory and motor abilities, such as pitch and rhythmic discrimination, melodic contour perception, and finger sequencing. And that was from Schlag's 2015 study. And in Gazer and Schlag's 2003 study, they determined that a positive correlation means that the gray matter volume is highest in professional musicians, intermediate in amateur musicians, and lowest in non-musicians. Also, fun facts, asymmetry in the planum temporale, located just behind the auditory cortex, has been linked to the ability to perceive perfect pitch. Neuroimaging is a relatively new method of mapping our brain extensively. This field has opened up neuroscience to be applied to many other fields, including music. However, it is still incredibly difficult to interpret these images when applied to said fields. Only more research can lead to better results and conclusions. So I just wanted to list all of these types of methods that we've been using for neuroimaging. So the intracellular recordings are measures of the electrical activity of single neurons. The electroencephalography, or the EEG, is the electrical activity of neuronal populations. Through magnetic activity that is coupled with the electrical activity, you'll be using the magnetoencephalography, or the MEG. Indirectly, through the measures of brain metabolic activity, is the positron emission tomography, or the PET, and the functional magnetic resonance imaging, or the fMRI. A newer study is diffusion tensor imaging, or the DTI, which provides information about white matter microstructures by measuring diffusion properties of water molecules. One study did note that men and women do have different brain structures, so it is important to keep this in mind when analyzing neuroimaging studies. So again, this can only be corrected and accounted for with more research into that particular subjects of gender disparity, and also how music affects different brain, like how music affects different gendered brains. Okay, so emotions and physiological effects are kind of obvious when you pair it with music. Like when you hear a song you like, you're obviously going to be happier or in a better mood. And if you listen to maybe 12-tone stuff, you might not be quite as pleased, unless you're into that. So it's also important to note that dopamine and serotonin are released when you're playing music. So dopamine is released when a new enjoyable task is completed. Say you're improvising something and it sounds good, dopamine will be released. And serotonin will be released when a sense of satisfaction is deemed after completing a task the correct way. So if you're doing your scales, which tend to be played in one general way, you'll release serotonin if you complete it correctly. So another important thing to note that according to Schlag's 2015 study, he did determine that children who were musically trained had higher vocab and language capabilities in accordance with like pitch like perception, and they also showed superior like auditory capabilities, motor capabilities, and he did mention mathematical like comprehension. However, this is still unclear as not enough research was done into it. So for music and language, the overall consensus is that even though there are many overlapping areas between language and music, and inherently they seem connected, there's still many cortexes that don't overlap. They're separated by this is language and this is music. So currently in the community, in the scientific community, music and language do have different sources in the brain, but there are still that connect and overlap. So I'd just like to read a short passage from Daniel Levitin's book, This Is Your Brain on Music, where he delves deeper into the connection between music and the application to science. So the amygdala, long convinced the seat of emotion in mammals, is adjacent to the hippocampus, long considered the crucial structure for memory storage, if not memory retrieval. Now we know that the amygdala is involved in memory. In particular, it is highly activated by any experience or memory that has a strong emotional component. Every neuroimaging study that my laboratory has done has shown amygdala activation to music, but not to random collections of sounds or musical tones. Repetition, when done skillfully by a master composer, is emotionally satisfying to our brains and makes the listening experience as pleasurable as it is. So, but it's important to know that, like, regardless that there are different cortexes for language and for music, it's still just as vital to understand that there are so many that still overlap. So it is proven that intensive music training can induce language recovery and acquisition. So with some of these therapies are in use today. So MIT, or melodic intonation therapy, is used for clients with non-fluent aphasia. So they can't speak the words, but they can sing them. MST, music supported therapy, is there to refine hand coordination. So for like clients with Parkinson's. AMMT, or auditory motor mapping therapy, is used for clients on the autism spectrum. And that's like just a few of the therapies that music therapists have used. It's also been proven that there are lower rates of depression in groups that use music compared to groups that do not use music. For teaching, the only implication that neuroplasticity has on the brain is to practice deliberately with your students and to understand that when learning different instruments, students will build different neural pathways to adapt, making it more crucial to have kids start an instrument and gradually introduce other instruments on them, not just all at once. That could result in a lack of motivation and frustration for the student. And this is all to build the strongest like white matter and gray matter connections. So in conclusion, music and neuroplasticity are definitely related, and this is due to like increased myelination, and that is from deliberate practice, and it ranges from all ages, and it's mainly apparent, definitely apparent in musicians versus non-musicians. There still is a high need for research in neuroimaging and how that applies to music in order to fully substantiate like my claims and the claims of the current community, the current scientific community. And then for teachers, it is important to base their music curricula in neuroscience. So with new information, we want to continuously update and ensure that students in the next generation are getting the best possible outcomes. And what better way than learning how the brain works? This is my bibliography. And I would like to thank Dr. Birch-Paces and Santha Zake for providing me with suitable resources that pertain to this project. I would also like to thank Professor Lemoncello and Dr. Brown for providing me with such a stable foundation for how hearing and neurology are deeply intertwined. And finally, I would like to thank the audience and hope that this information can be applied to your own careers, as it has immensely supplied to my knowledge of my own. Thank you.